Are we live?
We are.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome to the third meeting of the Governor's Council on Economic Expansion. I'm Rosalind Robinson, the Commissioner of the Department of Labor and Industry, and I am very pleased to be with you this afternoon. This meeting is being held remotely due to the ongoing COVID pandemic. Minnesota statutes section 13D .021 allows us to hold remote meetings during the pandemic because in-person meetings or meetings conducted are in-person meetings or meetings conducted under section 13D.02 is not practical or prudent of a health pandemic or an emergency declared under Chapter 12. With that, welcome to the meeting today, and I will pass the mic to our facilitator, Paul Williams.
Thank you, Rosalind, and welcome everybody. Week 3, we are digging into it. It seems, I just kind of get done thinking about the last week, and boom, we're into the next week. So we're moving really quickly, obviously, and grateful for everyone, giving this the time to this, and the good thinking and discussion. Feels like we're off to a good start. Recall that we're here in kind of this first several weeks. This first 4 weeks or so is all about just kind of generating some common learning and kind of building a common baseline, really, of data and information, and tons of good questions and additional information already kind of flowing back to the staff out of our first couple of weeks even. So really appreciate all of that. Today we wanted to drill down a bit further on the impact of the pandemic, particularly in BIPOC communities. And we have our first panel is really representatives of 4 cultural networks, is the best way to put it. Years back, probably I'm guessing even close to 15 years ago, I was part of a group that helped kind of found the African American Leadership Forum, which at the time was, hey, how do we better connect just leaders within our own cultural community, right? Across generations, across disciplines. That work helped spawn some other thinking that was already going on and already happening even in other culturally specific communities. And those groups have come together for several years now and worked across their cultures as well as within their communities. It still is one of the when I go to Alpha events, it's one of the most inspiring thing. I love going and just bumping into some of these young, brilliant leaders who I just never would bump into from different sectors. And I know that's true in each of our 4 predominant, very diverse themselves communities of color. So we're going to hear from leaders in those 4 organizations today, just about kind of their sense of the impact of the pandemic, but also kind of what are kind of possibilities and what seems promising in those communities. So let me stop there. I'm going to Marcus Owens from the African American Leadership Forum, Botao Uribe from CAL, the Coalition of Asian American Leaders, Ryan Molso from Latino Lead, and Kelly Drummer. Is Kelly on yet?
Kelly has not joined yet.
Kelly has not joined yet. All right. Well, we'll kind of push her to the back of the presenters. And really, today we are wanting to have more of a conversation, not so much presentation. So we've got several questions that I'm going to ask of our presenters, and we'll try and bump it around a little bit more and less of a kind of a PowerPoint type set of presentations. And I'm going to ask each of you have bios for each of our presenters today. Really impressive group and some really incredible backgrounds that each of these folks brings to this. So I want to just start and ask each of our panelists, and I'm actually going to just jump around here a little bit. Bo, I'm going to ask you to maybe start and just talk about kind of the just a few words about the impact of the pandemic in your community, and what has kind of surprised you? In terms of continuing impact, what's one thing that has really surprised you, as well as kind of giving us an overview of the impact, as well as the social unrest and all that multiple pandemics that have layered on top of each other?
Thanks, Paul, and hi, everybody. Good to be with you this afternoon. And I'm here on behalf of the Coalition of Asian American Leaders. And I think we, like every Minnesotan and every community, the Asian community has been impacted, right? Both by COVID and then the conditions created because of COVID, but also in the racial reckonings that have followed the killing of George Floyd. And so, I think very specifically, this is a very diverse community. For those who may know very little or maybe just some about the Asian Minnesotan community, it's about 5% of the Minnesota population, 300,000 people just about, and 60+% of that community is foreign born, with a large proportion residing in the Twin Cities, but growing pockets all over the state, right? So, and there's over 40 different ethnic groups who speak nearly 100 languages and all of those things. So it is very diverse, and it is served by, I think we have data for about 40 organizations that are either religious, ethnic, or linguistic organizations. And so I think in this time, what we have seen is really just the complexities of that coming together in a multi-layer crises that have hit the community. And so some of the very first things that we started hearing about were really about, before the pandemic closures, we were hearing from the community about the increasing targeting of Asians because of COVID, and how COVID was linked to as, the Chinese virus. And so even before the pandemic closures, we were getting calls from the communities who were concerned about their personal safety. They were being treated differently, and that kind of connection led to then I think people feeling a sense of lacking personal safety and things like that. And then when the pandemic closures happened, we also heard a lot from communities who had then other barriers, right? So in particular, our community members, we heard a lot about I think segments of the community who were already vulnerable, but made even more vulnerable because of what was happening. So those who were linguistically isolated, those who lived in large multi-generational households, those who were low income, those who had, mixed immigrant status in their families, trying to figure out how to support all of the individuals, and in those families became even more challenging because people couldn't just go out and ask other people because they couldn't talk to people or didn't feel safe. And then there were technology challenges and those kinds of things. And so in particular, as it relates to economics and things that we heard from communities who were frustrated because they didn't know who to turn to get information because they were linguistically isolated, right? So by the time they heard something, it was weeks or months behind, and so then they couldn't access it or even when they had access the information, the system was all in English. So it made it difficult for them to get unemployment, for example, because they were already so far in the line behind others who were fluent and technologically able to access support. We also heard a lot from micro businesses. These are not large businesses. These are mom and pop shops who have revenues of less than $250,000, who really, they were just employing themselves. In the initial waves of support, they were not really included in in that. And even when things like the PPP became available, they didn't know how to apply for it. They also felt very much like they were already so small, they didn't want to take on more loans, right? That they didn't know if they would even survive out of COVID. And so, but what they needed was to continue to pay rent, to continue to make sure that they could support their families. So the list goes on and on, Paul, but those are just some initial things that we were able to gauge right away, because as a network, we had our hands and legs a little bit all over the community. And so we became kind of a central hub for the communities who felt like they could tell us something about what was happening to them. And then that we would try to help figure out where to triage information to get some help for them.
And say a little bit more. That the other question I had there is, so in terms of kind of the lingering effects of these multiple pandemics, what's one lingering effect that has surprised you, or just something that you're surprised that kind of as you think about kind of the current state, again, very diverse community, but what's one thing that seems to be sticking around that catches you a little bit by surprise?
I think that sort of the concept of mutual aid and how people came together. So mutual aid, not just like in serving people, families, and individuals with the needs that they had, but the ways in which the community continues to, I think, try to come together to get information out to the community. So I think we were able to, out of this period, form a number of other types of partnerships and collaborations across our very diverse community in order to address things like language needs, or to make sure that we were talking to different segments of the community. And so those partnerships continue. I would also say that the lingering effects of both a community that felt very stigmatized because of COVID, and that those issues still continue now because they linger because of how I think the community in total has stepped up to say that violence that targets a community in this global pandemic is by no means right, but also that there are those effects, right? And then lastly, I think segments of the community that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID deaths are dealing with that, right? So we have the Hmong and Karen community where 40% of the deaths in the Asian community from COVID came from these communities, and I don't think that people have looked at data that closely. And so, what does that mean in terms of the economic consequences to people who, to families, right, who are still dealing with those deaths and the both health and mental health issues in the community. And so I think there is a rallying around to support community to make sure no one is left behind. But then there is also the conditional things that we continue to need to address. And I also think that the community has tried to be really creative using technology. And I hope that part of the thinking going forward is how can technology facilitate things like language access instead of being a hindrance and a barrier for communities who maybe need other types of access, right? So, and then we also saw, like in our leadership programming, before people would have to travel from rural areas to attend our leadership programming, but we actually found that in this time they could virtually from, Walnut Grove or, Marsh Shore or some other places, because we were all virtual and we tried to really test out those things. And we found that people generally still appreciated the programs and had the same level of satisfaction participating, even though it's virtual, right? So I think we're learning about the tool of technology itself, and I think we should think more about how to invest in that, but with particular populations in mind. Yeah.
And Ryan, I'm going to tee you up next year, but just one final question, Bo. There's an assumption, of course, that the Hmong Southeast Asian communities are the largest of the Asian communities. Is that true? And are there other Asian, not sub, but other dimensions of the broader Asian community that are also quite sizable?
Yes. So the Hmong community is still the largest, but we have a very fast-growing Asian Indian community and a Chinese community that comes here because our economy demands their expertise. And what was interesting during COVID, and I shouldn't say interesting, but a challenge, is that some of these workers became stuck in limbo, right? Because they were stuck in visa situations that were neither renewed or, that their visas were up for renewal. And then you had the whole system that I think was trying to figure it out. And then they couldn't return home because the borders were closed. And so they were really there was just challenges for our foreign workers who are coming here for our economic benefit, but became stuck in this moment. And I think that as a state that is trying to both think about the future and the now, but that where we know we need a net in-migration of people, whether they are foreign or domestic, in order to keep our economic engine going. I think we really have to think about this population. And so, so the fastest growing communities are both in the Asian community, are both those who come as refugees and those who come as educated workers, right? So it's like polar opposites, and they have different needs. Yeah.
It's really powerful. Thanks. Ryan, can you just talk a little bit about in your world? Can you just say a little bit about kind of the continuing impact of these multiple pandemics in the various Latinx communities?
Yeah. First, I just want to say, I feel honored to be in this space with so many leaders in our state, and excited to be able to share my perspective. I am one voice of many. Minnesota has a large population of Latinos, and like Bo said, I feel like I'm going to echo a lot of the things that Bo shared, because we do have some overlap in terms of, our state is, we're about 6% Latino. And that means about 314,000 folks. I'm looking at a screen so I can get the stats right. And of that, many of them are from Mexico. So like my family, I'm a second generation Latino. I come here and speak with the voice of my ancestors who came from that space and place. And her journey was through making tortillas with her hands. The only reason that we're here is because she was able to pick the corn, grind it, and make it into tortillas. And I think that narrative is still very similar to even today, where people are really grinding to make ends meet and to get by. One initiative that we've been involved in is Gateways for Growth, which is in St. Paul, Minneapolis. And they're doing research on immigrant communities. And specifically what they came out of understanding is during COVID, unemployment, was like unprecedented, the worst in generations. But for immigrant community, it was actually not much impact, because many of them were servicing, essential jobs, essential services. And so, they didn't see the unemployment that other folks did. But what that meant is they were exposed to, significantly more risk And so while we knew that in narrative, this data supports it. So I'll share it in the chat after I'm done talking, so you can look more in depth at that and have more time to process some of this. But to me, it's really interesting to see how COVID has played out in our community. The other things I think about too is that when it comes to these folks who are working, many of them come from undocumented backgrounds or from mixed status families. And so there's a lot of fear around like seeking benefits, whether that was, food assistance or unemployment benefits, and just also like trying to get a test. People really, having that language barrier, and also just like the systemic, lack of understanding, and also like the system not necessarily really translating anything for them to access. So while we told people to get vaccines and stuff, the rollout of information for our community didn't match that. And so it was difficult for folks to really access the services that they need to perform their jobs. The other thing I would share too is, we got a tremendous amount of funding from ARP, American Rescue Plan funds, which is great, but that's all federal funding that can't actually go to undocumented folks directly. And so we need to find creative ways to figure out how do we take those federal dollars and find partnerships within our community to actually service the people driving our economy. The last thing I'll share on this is, this is a council on economic expansion, and, Latinos make up an oversized proportion of jobs in manufacturing. They make up about 35% of those jobs, or I should reframe this. Immigrants make up about 35% of manufacturing jobs, and Latinos are a large section of that. 40% of essential workers are immigrants, and Latinos make a large portion of that. And 33% of business owners are immigrants or refugees, and we make up a large proportion of that, including my family. And so I find it a little troubling and kind of confusing that there's, 15 labor, business, philanthropic, nonprofit leaders here, but there's no representation of Latinos. And we're 6% of the population, but we are one of the fastest growing. So if I think about what economic expansion should be thinking about and who should be at the table, it would be my community. And so I find it troubling that you can't find out of 314,000 people, one person who has the credentials to sit on this council. And so I want to lift that up, because I think it's important to talk about. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and we are not cool with being on the menu. And I would also mention that the governor, when he says one Minnesota, what I see here is some Minnesota.
Thank you. Fair point. My question to Bo, I'll ask of you as well, is as we've again kind of gone through these multiple pandemics here over the last 18 months plus, what's one lingering challenge, struggle that kind of has stuck around, that has kind of surprised you, or that you're particularly struck by?
I don't know if I want to respond to that question, because I think it's important to talk about this representation issue. I bring it to this council because y'all represent us in many ways, and I want to talk about that, I think, at least a little bit, rather than moving on and just saying, let's play like usual.
I appreciate the point. I'm going to ask Steve to respond to it. I want to stay on agenda here again, and I want to get to our other speakers as well. But Steve, do you want to address that?
Yeah, Ron, I appreciate the point, and you surfacing it here, and we've had separate conversations about it as well with you and Ruby and others, and I think it's a fair point. We're bound by a set number of people that can be in the council, but I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong, that Latino representation in this council wouldn't be really important. So, we've had you and Ruby in our first few meetings here as speakers. That's important. We don't consider that the menu. We consider that that's central to the context that we're sharing. And there'll be more context, but I do appreciate you raising it. I think it's really important. It's something the governor himself is aware of, and that we've talked through with several stakeholders. We're limited by the number of people we can bring into these, but that doesn't mean that any one group or angle is more important. And part of these conversations is to surface these issues and have really open, honest conversations about where our state's headed and what we need. So I do appreciate you raising it. We do have a packed agenda of a lot of things we want to learn from you about your community and other speakers too, but let's continue to discuss it, and I appreciate you pushing us on it.
Absolutely. I appreciate your response, and also just taking that feedback in stride, because I know nothing is perfect. I don't expect us to do everything perfect every time, but I think it's important to continue to have that conversation and to use the power and influence that you have in the circle that you have to do something about it. So I appreciate that. And to your question about what's lingering, well, COVID's still here. So these dangers still exist, you know, and we see spikes across the country. So I think if anything, we have to think more long-term about how do we provide services when there are no more federal funding, you know, resources to support the things that we need, where like, how do we keep a system of translation happening so that the state can provide information across a variety of communities to make sure that they can have access to the things that they need to beat some of those, you know, barriers that we see. The other thing that I think about too is like, that the big thing is finding ways that we can get funding to undocumented folks. They play a huge role in our economy and provide a lot of tax funding for our community as well. So I think if we can think about that community in terms of how do we build our economy, we're actually going to build a better economy. And so as we come out of COVID, you know, just figuring out partnerships within our own community that can funnel dollars and resources to make sure that they can access, you know, childcare, affordable housing, things like that. And I'll talk more about that later, I think, about how affordable housing can be a really strong area that we can improve in.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Kelly Drummer, are you out there?
Yes, I am.
Great. Fabulous. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Okay.
Can others see Kelly? No?
I'm on video.
All right.
No, we can't.
Steve, you can?
I can see her, yeah. I mean, if you go to large gallery mode, it can kind of show you everybody that's using their video. So maybe Kelly's video isn't popping into the screen, but if we can all hear her, and if you use large gallery, some of us can see her as well. It's in the little 3-dot menu at the top of Teams. If you go to large gallery, you can see every face. But she should pop up for everybody since she's speaking, so I'm not sure why that's not happening, but.
That's what I thought. I see you there. Thank you. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Paul.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. So again, you've kind of, the opening question is really just, you know, kind of the continuing impact of the multiple layers of pandemic on your diverse communities within Native communities. Just kind of what jumps out at you?
Well, I just want to say thanks for having me on the panel, and you know, that I'm able to represent the community. And Migizi actually is a youth organization, and so we work quite a bit in schools with different districts in after school programming, and then we have a career pathways programs and first persons productions and media and green jobs. And you know, COVID hit us really hard because of the schools, our lack of ability to engage in the schools, and then shifting all of our training that is in person to a virtual environment. And our biggest challenge was really the engagement with students. It was basically up until the past month or so, we really didn't have the ability to engage with students because we're working so closely with the schools, so closely with the kids, and not being able to be in the classroom, not being able to provide after school programming. And then the other stressor for us was the civil unrest and the loss of our building. It hit our community very, very hard. Not only were we struggling with COVID, but we suffered a tragic loss of a building that was basically brand new that we had just as a community built. So that trauma in itself for our young people to kind of go through COVID, through civil unrest, to have that loss of their safe place and safe home was very challenging. And we didn't actually get into our own place until March, and we're on 32nd Street, not far from our other location. But you know, that impact of not having a home base, not only for myself, but our staff, but our young people in the community, and the ability, you know, like I said, that ability to engage. That has been our biggest challenge, and I think the schools right now are still having that challenge. And I believe that's going to be an ongoing challenge, that learning loss, the re-engagement, and the importance of some of the programming that we have is all relationship built, hands-on. How are you getting young people involved in media and green jobs? It's a hands-on approach. The virtual space was very challenging, especially when you're learning something new and you need that direct instruction. So those have been our biggest challenges, but really, the not having a place was one of the largest, and I think many of you know of that loss. And so we are on a track to build a new building on Lake Street on 18th and Lake. So that's the promise we all have and our young people have.
Yeah, it was a huge loss, Kelly, and for those of us who have known Migazee's work over many years, it was just devastating, just devastating. You mentioned kind of that continuing learning loss. My second part of my question to each of you is what's kind of lingering, what's hanging around that has surprised you? And I don't know if that's a surprise to you necessarily or not, but anything else that stands out as something that just kind of sticks with you in terms of something that is lingering, that is continuing?
I would, say that engagement piece, because when kids have really been isolated for 18 months and that re-engagement has been difficult, and then re-engaging with your partners as well. You have to kind of do a do-over all over again. Okay, what's this partnership look like? How are we going to work in the classrooms? What's needed? So it was like, that's where we were 18 months ago, and then you have to go back. So, and all of that takes time. And my feeling is our kids can't wait. They're going to be our future employees, particularly in these growing fields that we work in media and green jobs. And then our work in education, getting kids to college. Those are things that cannot wait. When we have learning loss of almost 2 years, some of the students that came in were in 9th grade, and they came to our open house last week, and they're in 11th grade. And one student said, he's like, well, I flunked pretty much all last year. And I said, well, how can we help you, make that up? But so when you actually you're in your old building, COVID hits, and then, 18 months later, you see a kid that was in 9th grade that's a junior. It's kind of like, wow, it makes it really real. How impactful that learning loss or that engagement or that well-being, those cultural connections that we also provide mean to kids, and that when you don't see them for almost 2 years and they come back to you, it was like a welcome home. You're back. So that's what was really shocking to me last week, actually seeing some of the kids we hadn't seen. I see that as a struggle with schools, a lot of other nonprofit, a lot of youth employment organizations that are working with kids, is that how do you get kids back engaged?
I want to come back to that, because I think the whole youth employment arena is a really critical one, and I want to ask your colleagues about that as well, how that is playing out in each of the other communities as well. Marcus, do you want to introduce yourself? And we all know you actually from the council itself, but just say a word about ALF, and then what are you seeing as kind of the continuing impact?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to my colleagues for representing and kind of telling the story, because I think all of our communities are kind of have a lot of similarities of how this pandemic has impacted us. And just for the call here, I'm the executive director of the African American Leadership Forum. We're a network of over 6,000 leaders in the community, institutions, allies, and other system players that work together to collaborate and champion solutions that are going to impact a positive experience for the African American community here in Minnesota. One thing that, just to talk about like the effects of this pandemic, and it is I guess a quad pandemic for our community if we look at it, because we've been impacted health-wise, economically, both for businesses and employment, our youth and education. There's just been a plethora of issues that have happened. But what I would say that has been definitely present as we've gone on this journey is that we lack people infrastructure to respond appropriately in community. And as an organization, what we were faced with is trying to understand what was going on with our community in real time, of trying to help solve for problems. And what it felt like early on, with the closures of schools and with businesses closing on, we were at least 6 to 12 weeks behind the solutions that were coming. So when students were sent home, our parents weren't ready to put them on to online school. Technology was a huge issue, and even just being able to adapt to their lifestyle so that they can accommodate students being at home. So that put our students back 6 to 12 weeks early on. And then when the businesses closed, being able to access PPP was a big problem. We were at least 6 weeks behind that first wave of PPP. So as I started to see kind of what was happening in our community, what really felt like was, wow, as many of the good things that were happening prior to the pandemic, and I felt like there was a lot of hope and a lot of just positive energy that we were doing economic development and we were seeing more young people get involved in the work of community, and there was tangible things like actual ownership being able to increase, and jobs, people were getting into jobs, and we were focusing on mental health, that we were really on fragile ground, fragile foundation for this. And that really showed up when our organizations had to step up and try to respond to community. Many did, and there was a lot of bright lights. For instance, shortly after the unrest, we were able to organize many in the mental health community and the healing community to provide 90 days of healing, so that folks could deal with the pain and the trauma that they were experiencing throughout the spring and the summer. And some of that work is still continuing on with Dr. Joy Lewis and the Time of Reckoning. There was folks really organizing to engage our youth, and some of the lingering effects of this pandemic has been, a lack of a feeling of safety in community. And so you see it play out in the streets with violence, and we have churches and other organizations out engaging with youth today with the 21 Days of Peace. So there's this mix, but when I look at it, what you see with public safety is not because people are inherently violent, but they're actually reeling from the issues of the pandemic, whether they're still out of jobs. African American rate for unemployment is still double that of the mainstream, or the kids going back to school and not having necessarily the outlets that they can go to release some of the tension and the pain that they face with. There's a lot of ordered steps to the reason why things are happening the way that they are on the streets. And in order for us to kind of turn this back around, we really have to think about how we're investing in those people, holistically, and addressing it from, housing now and affordable housing becoming an issue now that some of those orders of protection are gone. Jobs and getting people into jobs that are going to be productive for them in the future, not just a gap. But most of all, in all of this is mental health and how we're helping people get back to a sense of normalcy, because it's not going to just flip a switch on and everything just goes back to normal for folks and they can get jobs and go back to school. There's some underlying and undergirding issues that, we need to address as it relates to mental health and trauma-informed care at different levels, not just in clinic, but on the street, and engaging folks in a real way that helps them see that they're a part of a community and not just on their own. I'd say that, Paul. You're on mute. I love that I got to say that to you.
I know, thank you. You got me. Coming back to each of you, and Marcus, I'm glad you talked about those promising steps that you saw in the African American community, literally right off the bat, and continue. And several of you also talked about kind of promising. Just real quickly, what are some areas of opportunity that are kind of standing before you? And then the second question I want to ask you is as you think about one of our challenges is to identify some priorities, recommendations for the governor and lieutenant governor on the use of one portion of the ARP dollars, and what are a priority or two that you would put in front of us. But so first question is about what's something promising, an opportunity that you see out there. Second question, again briefly, is what's a priority or a focus that you would perhaps suggest to us. And let me just go back to let's see, Kelly. Let's start with you.
Yeah, I'll echo what Marcus was saying around mental health and well-being. I really feel like that is a core piece of our work that we've been doing, over the course of the past 2 years, particularly around the unrest. We had healing ceremony following that, a few of them, so that the young people in community can heal. So that is a core part of our work, and getting kids to want to re-engage, to feel good about themselves, to feel good about going back to school. And the other piece is focusing really on the youth employment piece. There is not a lot of money out there for youth employment. And, Migizi is very special and unique in the fact that we train young people in the fastest growing jobs in the country. And how can you help and invest in helping us provide the wages and get them interested in a career that produces living wages in the future and fits our cultural values, our Indigenous cultural values, and really our work in media. How do you have more Native people in media? And that's the other thing. How do we build those careers?
Kelly, can you just say a word about the green jobs work that you did? What are those jobs specifically that you guys are working around?
So right now they're projects, but really building young people's career pathway in the green economy. So we just finished up the summer home energy certification with Minneapolis Community College. Some are going to solar PV installation certification, OSHA certification, and then they work on projects. And how can we connect with the state and cities in further training for jobs of young people in an urban location? I mean, Excel's locations are in Hugo and way out there where you're not going to reach urban youth, regardless if they're Native, Asian, Black, whatever. We're open to anybody. But how does that and how do you support facility and things like that could make that happen, in those partnerships that need to happen so that we can grow the workforce in those fields?
Great, thanks. Ryan, how about you in terms of promising area of opportunity and priority or focus that you would suggest for us?
Yeah, I alluded to it a little bit earlier in the first part that I spoke, but I think there are two main sectors that Latinos participate in the most, which is restaurants and construction. And I think in the construction area, I see a lot of opportunity. There's a massive housing shortage, which means we need to build houses. And there's a huge uptick in terms of people who are building at this point. So I think that's a lot of opportunity to be able to, expand in that area, because, houses aren't going to get cheaper unless we have more to be able to provide folks. And so thinking of green ways to do that, whether that's, supports around more solar for families, but it could also just mean, more reasonably priced homes. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous out there for anybody to be able to purchase a home, and maybe finding ways in which we can subsidize some of that, down payment stuff would be great. But I think there's a lot of work we could do around housing that would provide awesome stability for a variety of communities, not just my own. So I see that as a huge opportunity moving forward.
Great. To council members, I hope you will start thinking about questions that you've got for the panelists. We'll transition to some Q&A here in the next few minutes. Bo, do you want to share a few thoughts on kind of promising opportunity areas and focus areas or priorities for us?
Sure. I think one of the promising areas, or area that I hope will be explored more, is really this whole area of family care. I think that we saw in the pandemic that there were so many ways in which people came and took care of each other. And so going forward, the question is, how will we both continue to incentivize and support that? Especially, we have leaders who now are going back into the workforce, or having to go back into the office, and they can't figure out childcare, right? So they've had to go back to kind of the traditional ways in which the they are asking their parents to basically leave the workforce to help them take care of their children. And that was very intuitive, but also that there is really not a lot of incentives to do that. And so I do think that the future is going to be, in the future, it's going to be important to really think about how we support family care. And then I would also say that making sure that we have a vibrant and thriving sector of organizations who have language and cultural abilities to service our diverse communities is really important, because I think that we saw that in this time, it was probably the diversity of the community that could access those who are most vulnerable. And it's going to still continue to be important. And so, yes, become Americans, right? That is part of all of our paths here, but at the same time, not to lose sight of the language that we need and the cultural sensitivities that we need to better serve our communities. And we saw that because we have diversity of organizations and we were able to put out just very small dollars to support them, but in turn, they were able to provide access and navigation support to communities that both saved government dollars, right? That if we don't do that, then we will have more crisis and layered crisis in communities. So I hope that those are things that we continue to support. And then that we also create a spectrum of support for small businesses, from those who are starting up, who have great new ideas because of what's happened, who can be helpful, but also to sort of the mid-sized businesses that need to be also thriving in this region, that we need to also really support that. And then I would just lastly say that I hope there's opportunities to also think about how government itself rewards its employees who are multilingual, because we reviewed a lot of translations during this time that were done so poorly that put out in community actually caused more confusions, when the people on the inside actually had the language and the context for doing that, but they were just not rewarded to do that. So I think there's opportunities to really also support employees who are already in the sectors. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Bo. Everyone on my screen is frozen. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
It's frozen on my end.
We can hear you.
Okay. Yes. I'll just keep going here. Marcus, can you finish up with, again, that question about promising opportunity areas and priorities or focus areas?
Yeah, I think promising to me right now, there's a lot of great energy and there's a lot of awareness around the opportunity we have in front of us right now. And I think some of the debates or arguments we had in the past around, what is there a problem? What's the problem? I think we're beyond that. And I think it's the moment right now of how do we move from awareness to action, and how do we let go of some things that we may have thought could not be done, that, if we have a new lens and a new light, we can get there. I would also say, not to forget what, we were marginally investing in previously that was starting to work, whether that was into small businesses or into micro enterprises in that space, or even, thinking about the underemployed or unemployed, right? Those are all areas that are even more present today that need to be addressed. But I would challenge us to think about, as a council, of how do we scaffold or create a continuum of investment at different stages, particularly thinking about youth, thinking about our low-income community members that are looking to get to a basic quality of life. And so what do we have to scaffold to get them there, and recognize that it isn't just investment in, say, creating a job, but there is a spectrum to which that individual is going to need to be prepared. A lot of that is some of the work around mental health and just being able to develop the interpersonal work that a person needs to do so that when they do show up on the job, they can stay beyond 90 days because they have the resources and tools to address whatever trauma or other interpersonal things that they have to deal with, whether it's housing, food insecurity, childcare, et cetera. Beyond that, I think we're going to have some immediate things that we're going to need to do to invest in, but whatever long term we have to look at as well. So short term, I would think about youth engagement, youth development. We need places for our 12 to 25-year-olds to be. Some of it is workforce. Some of it is just a safe place where they can build community and see themselves as part of a community versus just on their own. Housing, I'll say it again, mental health, I'll say it again, and then business development and ownership opportunities is the areas I would focus on.
Great. Hoping folks can still hear me because you're all still frozen on my screen. I'm going to ask the four of you, actually. I know that the networks have done some cross-cultural work very intentionally in recent years. Can any combination of you just talk a little bit about that cross-cultural work in any sense that you have of how we might be thinking cross-culturally, kind of again moving forward in this time?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and Bo, maybe you can fill in some gaps for me here. The thing I would lean in on is this idea that we are not in competition with each other as community, and the whole idea of bringing linking leaders together or these various cultural networks together is the idea of how do we build solidarity? How do we start to think of each other as partners and as in community together? Because quite often the folks that we are trying to impact are dealing with the same systems and the same challenges as each other. And so over the last couple of years in particular, we've been focusing on what is that journey to solidarity? How do we understand the stories of our arrivals to Minnesota? And each of our communities, and even within our communities, have a different arrival story. And like, how do we represent and recognize that uniqueness to our experience here in Minnesota, but then also learn from it so that we can see, oh, well, that's very similar to the way that my family got here, or other parts of my community have gotten here. So we're really focused there, and then bringing our leaders into space together so that they build relationship. So if those are educators, education leaders, or community organizing leaders, or business leaders, how do we get folks in the same space and to see each other? So I'd say that part. Bo, what am I missing? Ryan?
No, I think you touched on all the parts of linking leaders, and the purpose of that is really just to build relationships and really to start on a different kind of foundation than I think we're used to historically, which is that every community has to figure out what piece of the pie they can get. And part of this is we're trying to all solve for the same problems, right? And so part of it is how do we both understand the complexities as they are and not try to, sweep that under the rug or anything, but also to build relationships so that we can know that when we are in spaces, we are both speaking our community's truth, but at the same time building for something that is more intentional about making sure that it is for the benefit of all communities as well. And so, a lot of our work has been relationship based, but also when there are things that are systemic, that we are able to address them together. And so both to Ryan's point today, both about this council, but also those opportunities as we engage with different sector leaders to know that each of us can show up and speak about our communities, but there is a collective need to ensure that we also don't leave anybody behind, right?
Again, everyone's still frozen in my screen here. Steve, I see some good questions and points in the chat. Steve, can you just respond there? I see that you've got a response. I can't quite see it all.
Yeah, no, I think there's some great points in the chat, Paul. And so sorry you're frozen. Maybe if you pop out and pop back in or something, that could work.
I'm gonna try that right now.
I'll steer the ship for a second while you try that. I think these are really good points. I think Nanoko, to answer your question, yes, at the direction of the governor and lieutenant governor, we've been extremely intentional about both who's on the council and who we invite, and yet we still aren't going to get that right for sure, and so or at least perfect. So we really welcome Ryan's and other comments on where we are getting it right and where we're not, and there's still several sessions ahead of us. So we welcome specific or general feedback about that. To your point on Greater Minnesota, next week, for example, we are hearing from a Greater Minnesota CEO. We're hearing from the chamber. We're going to hear from other Greater Minnesota leaders as well. And I like the connection you're making between some of our underrepresented populations and Greater Minnesota too, because of course it isn't just a metro rural issue in our state. So very well said and highlighted, and just appreciate you lifting that up. And for those who are +1ing it, I'll add my +1 to it. I just appreciate the surfacing of that.
Noko, I actually wanted to respond to that because I think we face that in our organization as well. It's like we have a lot of membership within the metro area, but for us, we've been intentionally trying to work across Greater Minnesota. So one example and narrative I think is helpful, maybe in terms of figuring out what to do. We visited Austin, which has Hormel as a kind of a corporation base. And so there was a pop-up from the Mexican consulate to help people with their paperwork so that they could continue to work and also make sure that they're doing everything that can to engage. Okay. All right. Doing everything that they can make sure that their paperwork is up to date. And one thing that we heard there was like, while they want to do what they want to do, the consulate as a part of, not anything that we have control over as Minnesotans was not necessarily supporting people in the community. They were turning people away left and right because they didn't have a particular piece of documentation that matched perfectly. So, while this person is trying to do their job, they're also trying to make sure that they get everything done. The people who we're trying to partner with as a state wasn't providing that service for them, even though it was something that they wanted to do. So that's just the thing that I think about when I talk about the needs of Greater Minnesota and specifically Latinos. That is a big thing where they're trying to do their job and live their life and do everything right. And that's a barrier that we as Minnesotans may struggle with.
We've got about 7 minutes here. Any questions, other questions that council members have, comments?
Hi, Paul. It's Neil. By the way, your video has been actually coming through great. So I've been able to see you the whole time and hear you. So, Ryan, you talked about housing and construction of new homes as an opportunity. I thought that was a great point. What do you see? I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit more to the barriers, because one thing that you were talking about. Everyone knows how expensive housing is getting for families across Minnesota. You're absolutely right. But one thing that just popped in my mind as I was listening to you talk was that imagine if the state took the money that's gotten from the federal government and just said, here, we're going to give it to families to go buy homes. You know what would happen? The prices of homes would go up. Okay, so that would actually be a windfall for the owners of homes who want to sell those homes. And it would help those individual families, but it would actually make the market more expensive. And so somehow, when we analyze this at the Minneapolis Fed, we need to find ways of getting a lot more supply to come in. Because if you just put more money chasing after the same number of homes, the price just goes one way, and that's up. So that doesn't actually solve the problem. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on what are you all seeing in terms of what are the barriers to people who want to build new homes, either the workers or the construction companies. Do you have any insight into what you're seeing, or are you seeing anything that we could try to focus on as a policy measure?
Neil, I'm glad you're an economist because my brain doesn't think like that. And I appreciate your vision to see it at a macro level. I'll just speak from my own experience because I can't speak for others, but I've been considering buying a home here recently, and it's incredibly difficult to build. The zoning that goes around this is parsed out by so micro, small. If anybody wanted to enter that as a newbie, you are screwed. Forget about a language barrier. Excuse my language, but seriously, it is difficult. So like that's a barrier that I think is built so deep in our system that it will hold out people from trying to build on their own independently, no matter what. Outside of that, I mean, I think I don't know. I would say I'd lean on others to respond to that.
Thank you.
Can I just say too, I think that there's also an opportunity to look at the types of housing stocks that we do built that, I think what's unique and what we've learned from many in our community is that home ownership level is low, some because for lower income families, it's because of affordability. For higher income families, it's a preference, right? That they also want to live in multi-family housing, but the housing stock is not always there, right? So how do we change zoning laws or change things that actually allow for families to be able to construct and live the way that they want to live in multi-generational homes? It caused vulnerability during COVID, but we continue to hear that the ability to live with elders and the ability to live in units where you have children and you have working individuals and you have elders but there just isn't simply enough housing stocks that are available and affordable for families to do that. So it might be an area to think about as well.
And what I would add to that is probably two parts. There's the, pre-buying a house and like helping folks navigate that journey to owning a home. We saw this in the earlier presentations, but the African American community only owns 24% of the homes that they live in today. So there is quite a bit of pipeline to build before we get to the parity in that space, which requires, I think, investment in first-time buyer training and down payment assistance. I think that would be a major investment right now, particularly as high as the cost of housing is. And then just the burden that many folks, first-time buyers in particular, take when they tack on things like mortgage insurance and such like that, which becomes a big barrier. And then just the second part of all this is just, I think what Ryan and Bo have called out is like the lack of inventory and the variety of inventory within our state. I think Itasca and McKinsey have done some reports around just the lack of units that are available for people to even purchase. So I would address those two items within the work that we can do.
And I would just say, as somebody who builds housing every year, right now in a good year, Minnesota produces about 3,000 units of affordable housing. We need a net additional somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 units per year. And so the scale of this, and it's also both on the ownership side as well as on the multifamily side. And this isn't just a metro issue, right? We're going to hear, I think, from somebody from DigiKey up in Thief River Falls, right? They can't expand their lines of business because they don't have enough housing to house workers who could do that. And that's true, right, in Rochester, that's true in Wilmer, that's true in St. Cloud, that's true in Duluth, that's true in Thief River Falls, across the state. Joe, I see you've got your hand up. I'm guessing you have something to say about that.
Well, it's construction, so that tends to be where I have an opinion for the most part. I think it's a multi-pronged approach and it's a multi-pronged issue. There's a lot of growth opportunity in construction. So you talk about living wages and the economic disparities of a person based off of their gender or their nationality or race. I'd like to think that although I do know it exists in organized labor pays somebody the same wage as a journeyman or journeywoman doing their respective craft, whether they're person of color, whether their gender is different, we pay them the same, and we set minimums, not maximums. So they can always pay somebody more based off of their experience, expertise, or leadership. When it comes to multifamily housing, that's kind of that perfect cross section you have to get to, where the cost of building the property or building the development doesn't outweigh what they can get in rent. And once one of those things gets off base, the development won't happen. So you need to pay people a living wage to build the place so that they could actually afford to be in there. But at the same time, they have to be able to charge enough to be able to make that up. Some of that can help through some TIF financing and things like that from the different municipalities where they're building these projects. That can help make sure that those two curves intersect to where it's actually a correct business model to use to do that. But there's a lot of multifamily housing that would need to be built. And then as one of you had spoken to, I think it was Bo had spoken to how you want multi-generational families within that. I once worked on a project called Cedar Riverside, which is right there, kind of the 35W94. At that time, I was a PM and I was working for a mechanical contractor. But one of the things I noticed about the families there, heavily African immigrant, Somali was a large portion of it, but they had several generations of their family living within the complex. And that's because it was a complex. So although they may not live in the same apartment, they were very close because there was, and don't quote me, 9 to 11 buildings that had homes in them. So you might have the grandfather over in one, but then the son in the other and the daughter, etc. But it was also built so that there was a grocery store there or right in the neighborhood. There was some schooling on site. So it was built as more of a community. Just from the get-go, that's how it was built, as opposed to just having it be a home and then you get the community from what's around you. It was within itself, its own community. And that's why I think you saw a lot of that there. So maybe as these developers think about what they want to build for multifamily housing, if there's data to support that, hey, multi-generational families would like to be living within these developments, that's different than single family homes, obviously, but that might be something that could be taken into account in the design. If that's something that it will weigh out and be financially viable for whoever is developing that. I think if it's worth it and it can be built and it financially makes sense to the developer, kind of that if you build it, they will come. Well, if there's a model for that and it can be a productive model, then I think it will get built. It just may be something that needs to be lifted up a little more. That's what people are looking for. So.
Fabulous. I'm going to transition us to small group dialogues. Thanks for all of the comments in the chats. Marcus, I saw your last one there around the Housing Made Affordable Act. I'm not sure what how that fared, but we can have staff kind of check into that and follow up on that, and we'll capture everything that's in the chat. Huge thank you to Ryan, to Bo, Kelly, and Marcus. Really, really appreciate you guys bringing your perspectives and your thoughts to this. Again, we're in a deep learning mode and just trying to take it all in and kind of across many different issue areas. So just really appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anytime with Marcus and Bo, I'm down. Kelly, it's also nice to meet you.
Yes, thank you.
All right. So we're going to transition into just small group conversation and just thinking about kind of takeaways, impressions, and particularly want to encourage you to think about themes, topics in our small groups that are starting to emerge as we're kind of coming through all of these learning sessions. We'll ask each of the groups to have someone prepared to report out. We've got a kind of a neat little tool here called Jamboard, which I think Nick is going to just tell us a little bit about. It's just a tool that helps in the virtual environment to just kind of capture ideas. We'll probably continue to use this tool, especially as we get into our synthesizing, prioritizing conversations. But Nick, you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So my name is Nick Peterson. I'm the manager. As you move into small groups. If you want to move across the board, if you look at the top, you can click a little down arrow and you'll see the 3 group boards. You'll also see a 4th board, which is a parking lot space. So as you come up with ideas, maybe they're not pertinent And then as the council members are, adding items to the Jamboard, we know that because it's not in Teams, some of you may not be able to interact with Jamboards and be on the meeting. The staff can also add some of your thoughts to the Jamboard for you as well. And they'll try to add some things as they're hearing. To add to Jamboard, you can add a sticky note, which is on the left-hand side, and it will pop up with a little note. You type in your note and you click save, and the note will appear in your Jamboard. You can also add text by clicking this little text box, and a text box will appear. With that being said, we're going to move you to small groups. And as yes,
Okay.
Paul.
That's great. Thanks. all back? Now we have a few technological challenges going on, but we had a good conversation in our group. So I hope everybody else did as well. And one of the things we're going to be trying to do in future meetings is actually take more time in the small groups, really to give us time to really dig in further. And again, we'll be looking to kind of create more structure to help us synthesize ideas. So let's hear a few report outs. Let's see, Jeff, is there someone from your group that was reporting out?
Yeah, we nominated Neil.
I was not, yes, everybody stepped forward, and then I stood there and everybody stepped back. Oh, I'm happy to do it on behalf of my group. So we have, we try to use this format, and I'll do my best to honor the insights and the values. On the insight side, you know, this first comment actually came from me. Overall, the scope of what we've heard over these last few weeks is, I mean, it's incredible. It's also overwhelming in the breadth of need across the state and across communities in the state. And one of the things we talked about was the need to focus, that if we end up trying to do everything, we're going to end up spreading like peanut butter and not make an impact on anything. So could we identify one or two areas where huge need, but with focused effort, we could really make a big dent? Some of the things that came up were basic necessities, affordable housing. We've heard about this over and over again. Access to healthcare, access to childcare. I mean, these are basics, but that affect so many families across Minnesota. Talked about, we heard about the need for reducing barriers for people entering the workforce and moving up. I mean, we hear that over and over again from employers who are desperate to find their talent and creating those pipelines for people to participate and contribute. Making it very forward-looking, investing in workers we want in the future. This big disproportion exists between low-level and high-level positions, and whether people of color and women get access to those higher-level positions and are invested in so they can be successful there. How can we build the necessary connections with the current influx of resources to set up a more long-term sustainable solution? This is something that it registered with me as some of my fellow panelists were talking. You know, there's certain of these big issues that are going to more easily lend themselves to short-term money and short-term solutions. Other ones are going to require long-term income streams. And so as we come up with a list of, okay, here are the 10 ideas that we heard, or the 10 big challenges, maybe one way of sorting them is which ones can we make the biggest dent with one-time money versus which ones require more longer-term investments. And I'll just give you an example. One thing that came up in our discussion was the need for affordable childcare, but the need for living wages for childcare workers, right? You hear both things at the same time. Childcare workers make very little money, and at the same time, it's unaffordable for families. How do you bridge that? The only way to really bridge that, as I've analyzed it as the Federal Reserve, is either the state or federal government providing long-term support to that sector so that people can earn livable wages and it's still affordable. That, the way I just framed it, one-time money doesn't lend itself to making much of a dent in that problem. There may be other problems where one-time money can make a big dent. Let's just say wiring Minnesota for broadband. You know, a one-time major investment in that could make a big long-term dent in that. So that's one way that we talked about trying to organize the various topic ideas that we may come up with. One other insight was, how do we make sure that if we're focused in an area, that the other areas are not being neglected by the other policy streams of the state government or of the federal government? So someone needs to take a comprehensive view, and we don't just think, oh, well, the feds have got this over here, when in fact they may not. So let's, on one hand, we don't want to duplicate what's already being done by other programs, but on the other side, we don't want to neglect something either. So I think, Steve, you and your colleagues will probably bring a really important lens in terms of, let's look at the landscape and who's covering what bases, so to speak. Then turning to values, a deliberate effort to address equity and inclusion. We think those are distinct but both important. Focusing on the future, and then just understanding the role the nonprofits and community organizations play and making sure that they are at the table and helping to design the long-term solutions and be part of that long-term solution. So anyway, that's kind of like a big dump of content. I hope to my colleagues that I honored you in characterizing that effectively.
Outstanding. Let's see, Steve, who was going to report out from your group?
Talia Palmer is going to be our spokesperson. We all volunteered her as our
Let's see here. Thanks, everybody. I'm not really sure who wants to follow Neil. I'm going to try something different that I've been kind of honing my skill set on with telecommuting. I'm going to add to your report. There's nothing you said we didn't say something towards or about. We noticed that there are common systemic long-term issues that are affecting many parts of Minnesota. We see the same things: economics, housing, childcare, connectivity, broadband. So rather than reiterating all of that information, I'm just going to add things that weren't shared that we talked about. And specifically, it was brought up the youth, the teenage population experiencing a jolt in their role as our workforce, our future workforce, and how we can potentially look at that right now and directly address what has happened with the mental health and the sort of loss of educational attainment and the loss of those engagements towards career thinking. Not simple, but more of a focused cohort model of that age group was discussed by our group, and noted that Minnesota we're 50th of high school counselors. Those are critical roles in our school districts. That's an immediate impact that we could make for all schools and all youth, especially those that are most affected by the disparities we're seeing in front of us. We talked about needing some common baseline language to look at, and one of them was, what is baseline, and getting people back to baseline. A really important point was the difference between recovery and rebuilding, and that not everybody is out of crisis mode right now. And many people who were providing the direct delivery of services are fatigued, and they are still dealing with the pandemic today. Some populations, that we're talking about don't trust the government. They're not going to show up for the vaccines. The vaccine is still spreading, and it's still a burden on the healthcare. So I think that was something unique that we discussed. I think that's the additional information that came out of our group. Did I miss anything? I can stay on the council.
That was great, Leah. That was a nice sum. Thank you. Oh, Paul, I'm sorry. You might be on mute.
I am. I didn't know I was on mute. Thank you. Scott was going to report out for our group, and again, Scott didn't even get a chance to volunteer. I just volunteered him. So thank you, Scott.
Well, we'll see. We'll see about it. I like the idea of not repeating ourselves, but certainly our group, talked about the themes of sort of community, caregiving, the idea of this kind of working over time on the theme of job training and career pathways and the importance of doing that in a variety of different ways. And we talked about government service delivery, which I haven't heard come up, but that was something that was an interesting insight from the panelists that we talked about briefly. I think as I look through our themes, I just would probably put an extra emphasis on housing. We talk quite a bit about housing, and is housing something that lends itself to one-time investment? It was a question I think we asked and started to really think about. And there was some discussion about what we've done in the past and how we have been increasing funding towards housing, but it's not enough, and we still need a surge, and there's a real gap between the number of units we have and the number of units we need. And then I really appreciated the idea of just thinking about, with housing in particular, but I think this applies elsewhere, that how work gets done is important. So, some one-time investments, it could apply if you're building broadband too. If you're making an investment, how the work gets done is important. So I think Joe made some good comments about just organized labor, where there's a real effort to make sure that you're creating good jobs when investments are being made. So affordable houses are being built by people who are making the kind of wage that would allow them to be able to prosper, and maybe take advantage of the housing or other opportunities from that job. And so I like that theme. And we also talked about how, like other areas of our economy, organized labor has some work to do in eliminating some of its systemic issues in terms of making sure everybody has equal opportunity to those jobs. Other than that, I guess the only other theme I'll bounce back to for a second is, it's just a lot of talk about community in different forms, but both this week and last week, just the impact in our communities, and particularly the communities that have struggled historically and might have been hit worst in the pandemic, is that there's just a lot of caregiving, childcare, caring for parents, caring for families, and there's opportunities that opens up in housing. When we hear about communities living close together and wanting to live close together, but there's also, as it's an example of a bottleneck where we believe that there's a lot of the labor force is being pulled out at different points because of the caregiving issues that emerge. And I think Tracy had a good example, just a discussion about, people who are later in their career, if they have to step out to do caregiving, for no wages, they come out of our labor force. And these might be people who would be great contributors to our labor force for another number of years if that didn't happen. So aside from the themes everyone else covered, those are some of the insights our group picked up on.
All right, fabulous. We are going to pivot here quickly to our last presenter. Thanks to everybody for good discussion. Again, sorry to pack so much in here. Assistant Commissioner Anna Mingy from Minnesota Management and Budget. One of the things we wanted to do was just give you some of the kind of parameters and a little bit of the guardrails here on the outsides of kind of the COVID dollars and how those are flowing and so forth. So Anna is going to give us a brief overview of this. We'll come back to this in a number of different ways in upcoming meetings. So Anna, apologies for being a little bit late to you.
No worries. I can certainly give up 6 minutes for our economic expansion of Minnesota. That's I'm happy to share my time. I can go pretty quickly. Tom, if you can move to the next slide. I'm Anna Mingy. I'm the state budget director, and I have my colleague Tom Carr is here, who is the executive budget officer, who is the lead on our ARPA work. I want to give first a share of the funds that Minnesota received from the American Rescue Plan. We received about $8.5 billion. Of that, $2.1 billion is flowing to local units. $2.8 billion is in the state fiscal recovery fund, which is flexible federal money, and that's the funding that is most directly under consideration by this group, though certainly other sources come into play. And then we received about $3.5 billion in some more program-specific federal resources. The largest single item is related to education, but there's significant funding there for childcare, housing, and of course, public health measures as well. And we can share. I heard some interest in understanding what some of those resources might be, and we're happy to share additional detail. The dollars went to local governments. About $1.1 billion are flowing directly to counties. $644 million are flowing to our 21 largest cities. And then the remaining $377 million is coming through state government to non-entitlement units, so remaining cities and towns. So let's talk about the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, the $2.833 billion. We ended the legislative session with sort of a framework for how those dollars would be directed. 1.183 of that total is being used for revenue replacement. That was part of the biennial budget that was just enacted, and that's the federal guidance allows state governments to use the funding to pay for government operations to the extent they experienced a loss of revenue, which is calculated based on a scenario outlined in federal guidance. And so we captured about 1.2 billion to use for our general fund budget. The legislature allocated 500 million for immediate COVID response, and that's sort of at the discretion of the governor, with some oversight from the Legislative COVID-19 Response Commission. And we've allocated about over 250 million of that so far, with large investments in education, so summer learning, we should say, higher education, some other education investments, and homelessness are some of the largest responses so far. And then that leaves 1.15 billion to be appropriated by the 2022 legislature. So I'll quickly go over some of the eligible uses. We sort of think of them in 4 large buckets. First, responding to the public health emergency. Second, addressing the negative economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And third, serving those the hardest hit, both from a health perspective and from an economic perspective. And then fourth, improving access to water and broadband infrastructure. The next slide provides more details among those 4 themes. And it was really, I'm glad I was able to hop on and listen to the tail end of your conversation, because I feel like I heard a lot of what I heard is reflected in the uses of this slide, and that's not an accident. When we think about responding to the public health emergency, that's items related to COVID-19 mitigation, like vaccines or vaccine administration, PPE. The guidance from the federal government around these dollars calls out behavioral health care really specifically. It notes the increased demand for behavioral health care. And so that's an allowable use. It also acknowledges the sort of long-term need for public staff in terms of for public health response. And that allows for some premium pay for essential workers. Next, addressing the negative economic impacts. So this would cover things like unemployment costs or training, food, housing, and financial assistance, support for small businesses, and support to impacted industries. For both of these, for all of these items, the guidance sort of has this continual hook to say, to what extent is this a result of or exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic? And I think we can really clearly identify that certain groups and communities were impacted disproportionately by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's really the intent of that third column, which we refer to as serving the hardest hit. So from a public health perspective, where are there health disparities that the pandemic exacerbated? And then from a more economic perspective, items like homelessness, affordable housing, and educational disparities. And then, as we also mentioned, some of the childhood environment factors. And then there's this sort of infrastructure component of the funding, sort of water and sewer and broadband, which I know is has been discussed. So there are a few things that we can't do explicitly. I should say that that table is an not exhaustive list of the allowable uses, but it's things that we like to highlight. But there are some things that we explicitly can't do. So the funds can't be used to offset a tax cut. We can't deposit them in pension funds or use them to bolster our reserve. They can't be used for debt service. And they also can't be used as a state match for other federal funds. So that's, I think, I come from the human services background. So for me, I immediately think of Medicaid. So we can't use it to draw down other federal funds. That doesn't mean we can't use it to fill gaps or braid funding streams and be creative with other federal funds. but it's about using, we can't use it as a match for other federal resources. And so I sort of flew through that because I wanted to give folks a couple minutes to ask questions, and our team is sort of at your disposal, whether or not, today or at a later date.
Thank you, Anna. Good overview, and a ton in there, especially in that list of eligible uses. Just sorting through that, it'll be good to spend more time with this. And again, a lot of what we've been talking about, I think, certainly falls into this. If anybody else has a question, just raise your hand. But real quickly, Anna, just want to distinguish the 2.833 billion in state dollars, in dollars coming to the state. You later mentioned 1.15 billion that the governor and legislature will jointly agree to. That is the funding that we are being asked to weigh in on. Just want to be clear about that, correct?
That's
or maybe
right.
it's a question for Steve or.
Anna, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that's right. So the 2.833 was our total award, and of it, 1.15 has left to be allocated, and that's the portion that this council's been asked to weigh in on.
And still a tremendous investment, obviously. And one of the things that's going to be challenging, I think, is there's some big investments that are being made by counties, by cities, in other parts of the state, by the federal government, that somehow we need to have a sense of as we're also thinking about how we would recommend this 1.115, or was the number I thought I had. Yeah, that the governor's asking about.
So Anna, if I could just clarify for the group one thing that we got on the summary sheet. It says use of funds must be decided by the end of 2024, and it clearly looks like the mission of the state is to address those in the 2022 legislative session. But then they need to be spent by the end of 2026. Is that correct?
Yeah, Tom, can you remind me of is it December of 2020?
Funds need to be allocated by December 31st, 2024. And then, for example, you could have a long-term broadband contract that the state actually makes cash payments in calendar years 25 and 26. So you could have your final expenditures going out in up until December 31st, 2026.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that for the group, because when we're talking about needing to come up with recommendations for a one-time spend, it could be a spend over 3 years or whatever to really get something jump-started.
Yeah, good point, Jeff. And I'll just add to Juhi's question here about how government is thinking about this. This is the primary council for which the governor is getting advice from leaders on a whole host of topics. There are, of course, all kinds of feedback mechanisms the administration uses and public feedback mechanisms as well, in addition to stakeholder conversations. But this council should be thinking about this holistically, I guess, would be the answer to your question, which is a good one.
Other questions? So again, just scratching the surface here, and more to come on all of this. Really appreciate your time, Anna, and all the work behind that. I know there's a ton that's gone into that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great. I mean, it's really an honor to be here with this group. Looking at the list of members of the council it's pretty impressive, and don't feel like I deserve to be with you all. So thank you.
Oh, stop. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Okay, so let's see. We've got just a quick. You've got a couple of pages that are fleshing out some of our future agendas a little bit. We've got moving pieces in that. Again, we needed to get some asks out ahead of time, so it's a lot of flex. we're hoping to hear from Tawana Black, who's the CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion. They've done a ton of work kind of around an inclusive economy and an inclusive approach, an equity-based approach to economic growth. And they've done some really good work. So again, more time for small, large group discussions. The October 11th meeting, the governor wanted us to hear from some of the other councils that have been working on some parallel and very much related issues. The One Minnesota Council on Inclusion and Equity, the Governor's Community Council on Inclusion and Equity, Governor's Children's Cabinet. Again, we'll hear from some of those folks, and then hear a little bit more actually from the DEED and DHS leaders just about in this last year or so, how have they been thinking and what input have they been hearing about the use of ARP dollars. So we'll just again factor that in, and then again keep the questions and comments coming and ideas coming on other folks you think we should be hearing from. We may have some flexibility in some of those future meetings. The October 18th, again, we're going to have about 4 meetings in the back half of this initial 2-month stretch where we want to get to more synthesizing, more discussion of themes, more discussion of priorities. Again, moving at warp speed here, I know, but we do have some flexibility in some of those upcoming meetings. And again, appreciate a number of good suggestions today. We'll capture all the chat information. Let me see. And again, be sure and reach out to Nick and Elizabeth, our lead staff folks. You can always send something to Jeff and I. And let me just stop there. Jeff, did I miss anything today?
You did a wonderful job.
Any hanging chads out there for you at all?
I don't think so.
Okay. Good. It is 4 o'clock on the nose. I appreciate all of your time. Good work. Again, just so wish we were in the room together. I think it would really add to this, but I think we're doing good in the virtual world here. So take care, and we'll talk to you soon.